They gave me a Thanksgiving ultimatum to sell my beautiful home to my sister for absolute pennies or be kicked out of the family forever. Instead, I sold it to a mysterious buyer who turned out to be her worst nightmare. What happened next made my parents scream in terror right on my front lawn. I am Nia, 35 years old, and somehow still navigating the sheer audacity of my own blood relatives. As a successful forensic accountant, I have spent my entire career tracking down missing assets and exposing financial fraud. But I could never quite account for the missing empathy in my own family. I had spent years building a peaceful life away from their toxicity, yet I still maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of duty. Just last Thursday, during our annual Thanksgiving dinner, my sister Camille decided to serve up the ultimate betrayal right over the cranberry sauce. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit across the table from a family member who smiled while trying to steal your peace and your hard-earned success. Growing up in a pristine upper-middle-class neighborhood in Atlanta meant everything was about appearances. To outsiders, we were the perfect family. Inside our perfectly decorated home, however, emotional coldness and blatant favoritism permeated every single room. I was always the reliable, quiet daughter who was expected to simply exist in the background, while my younger sister Camille was the undeniable golden child. Camille is 32 years old now, working as a vice president of marketing for a major lifestyle brand, and she has never once been told the word no by our parents. Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a neutral ground. I had driven across town to my parents' house carrying a homemade sweet potato pie and a desperate hope that we could just enjoy one single holiday without an argument. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest china and crystal glasses. The smell of roasted turkey and warm spices filled the air, giving a false sense of comfort. Sitting across from me was Camille and her husband Jamal. Jamal is 34 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit he definitely could not afford, and possesses a level of arrogance that only comes from leeching off his wife's family. He had spent the first half of the dinner bragging about his vague business ventures while contributing absolutely nothing to the conversation of substance. My parents Warren and Denise sat at the head and foot of the table beaming at Camille and Jamal as if they were royalty. The tension began subtly, as it always does. Camille started complaining about how cramped her luxury apartment was getting, sighing loudly as she twirled her wine glass. Jamal chimed in, mentioning that they desperately needed more space for entertaining high-profile clients and hosting important dinners. I continued eating my food in silence, knowing better than to engage in their performative complaints. I knew exactly how much money they wasted on luxury cars and designer clothes, all while secretly draining my parents' retirement fund to keep up appearances. Then the atmosphere shifted. The casual conversation stopped. Camille reached into her oversized designer tote bag, resting on the floor, and pulled out a crisp, thick manila folder. Without breaking eye contact with me, she slid the folder directly across the linen tablecloth. It knocked against the gravy boat, coming to a halt right next to my plate. I looked down at the document peeking out of the folder. It was a real estate contract. "Open it, Nia," Camille commanded, her voice dripping with an unwarranted authority. "Jamal and I have found the perfect solution to our space issue." I set my fork down, my heart beginning to beat a little faster, though I kept my face entirely neutral. I opened the folder. It was a purchase agreement for my home. My beautiful, fully renovated 4-bedroom townhouse that I had purchased 5 years ago with my own money. The townhouse I had painstakingly restored, spending countless late nights sanding hardwood floors and painting walls to create my ultimate sanctuary. The market value of my home was easily $650,000. I looked at the purchase price listed on the contract. $150,000. I stared at the number, waiting for the punchline of a joke that was not coming. I looked up at Camille. She was smiling a cold, predatory smile. Sign it, Nia, she said smoothly, taking a delicate sip of her wine. Jamal and I need the space for entertaining. Let's be completely honest here. You are a single woman. You do not need a 4-bedroom house all to yourself. It is incredibly selfish for you to hoard all that space when we are trying to build a family and a brand. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Before I could even form the words to reject this insane proposal, my mother, Denise, chimed in. She stopped eating her dressing and pointed her silver fork directly at me. Do not look so offended. Nia, my mother scolded, her tone defensive and sharp. Your sister is a vice president now. She has a very important image to maintain in her corporate circles. You just sit at a computer all day looking at spreadsheets. You could live in a 1-bedroom condo and be perfectly fine. Family takes care of family, and it is time you stepped up to help your sister. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, taking a slow, deep breath. I was absolutely refusing to let my voice shake. I looked at my mother, then at Camille. I bought that house with the profits from my forensic accounting firm, I said, keeping my volume low and steady. I did not ask for a handout. I built my business from the ground up, and I paid for my home with my own sweat. I find it fascinating that you need my equity. Camille, especially since Mom and Dad just dipped heavily into their retirement savings to fund your lavish destination wedding in Tulum last year. The room went dead silent. Bringing up the secret financial bailouts was the ultimate taboo in our family. Jamal scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair and adjusting the expensive gold watch that I knew for a fact my father had purchased for him. You should be grateful we are willing to take the property off your hands. Nia, Jamal said, a condescending smirk on his face. Maintaining a property like that is a huge burden for a single woman. We are doing you a massive favor. Plus, with the neighborhood values going up, we can utilize the asset much better than you ever could. A favor? They were trying to steal $500,000 of my hard-earned equity and calling it a favor. My mind immediately went to my daily work. As an auditor, I look for discrepancies. I look for the hidden motives behind financial transactions. Camille offering exactly $150,000 in cash for a home she could not afford was a massive red flag. But before I could analyze it further, the real explosion happened. My father, Warren, who had been quietly watching the exchange, suddenly slammed his fist down on the mahogany table. The impact made the crystal wine glasses rattle violently and the silverware clatter against the fine china. Enough of this disrespect, my father roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You have always been jealous of your sister. You have always tried to make her feel small because she is successful and married. We are a family, and in this family we support each other. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed into a terrifying glare. This is not a request, Naya. This is how it is going to be. You will sign that house over to Camille by Monday morning. If you refuse to support your own blood, then you are no longer part of this family. You will be completely cut out. I will write you out of the will, and I will make sure you do not see a single dime of your grandfather's estate. The ultimatum echoed through the dining room. Cut out of the family, cut out of the estate. They were holding my place in the family hostage over a piece of real estate, trying to bully me into financial ruin, just to feed my sister's insatiable greed. What my father did not realize was that I already knew the truth about the grandfather's estate. I knew it was practically empty, drained dry by years of covering Camille's credit card debts and Jamal's failed business ideas. They expected me to cry. They expected me to break down, apologize, and sign my life away just to keep their conditional love. Camille sat there with a victorious gleam in her eye, already sliding a designer pen across the table toward the contract. I looked around the table at the faces of the people who were supposed to protect me. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over my entire body. The fear and the longing for their approval simply vanished, replaced by an unbreakable resolve. I looked down at my plate, still piled high with Thanksgiving food I suddenly had absolutely no appetite for. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress, picked up my purse, and looked directly into my father's furious eyes. Keep the trust fund, Dad, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any emotion. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I did not slam the door. I did not look back when my mother yelled my name. I simply walked out into the crisp November air, leaving the contract sitting right next to the cranberry sauce. As I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out to see an email notification from my real estate lawyer. It was an urgent message about my property, an offer that was about to change the trajectory of all our lives. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, drowning out the faint sounds of argument spilling from my parents' front door. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, watching the sprawling colonial house shrink in my rearview mirror. The streetlights illuminated the perfectly manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood, a place that had always felt more like a movie set than an actual home. My chest, which should have been tight with the grief of being disowned by my own parents, felt remarkably light. My father had delivered his ultimate threat with the booming confidence of a man who genuinely believed he held all the cards. He thought the promise of my grandfather's estate would bring me to my knees and force me to hand over my property. But as I merged onto the highway, a quiet, genuine laugh escaped my lips. As a forensic accountant, my entire career is built on the absolute truth of numbers. Numbers do not lie, they do not manipulate, and they certainly do not play favorites. 2 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, I quietly looked into the public financial filings and the structure of his trust. My father assumed I was completely in the dark, but I knew exactly what was left in that account. Nothing. The grand estate my father weaponized tonight was a complete phantom. It had been systematically drained to maintain my parents' upper-middle-class facade, and most notably to fund Camille's extravagant lifestyle. Her destination wedding in Tulum last year, complete with imported orchids, and a 6-course dinner for 200 guests, was the final nail in the trust's coffin. I had seen the bank statements when my father desperately asked me for a short-term loan to cover his own property taxes just 3 months later. He had written checks he had no business writing, all to make sure his golden child looked like a millionaire on social media. Threatening to cut me out of a bankrupt estate was like threatening to ban me from a sinking ship. I was already safely on the shore, standing on solid ground that I had purchased myself. I pulled into the driveway of my townhouse. The exterior lights clicked on automatically, casting a warm glow over the restored brickwork, and the custom front door I had spent weeks picking out. This house was my absolute sanctuary. Every single square inch of it represented my hard work, my late nights poring over corporate audit reports, and my undeniable financial independence. I bought this place when I was 29 years old. It was an outdated mess back then, but I spent my weekends ripping out old carpet and painting walls to create a space that was entirely mine. I turned off the engine and finally looked down at the notification that had buzzed on my phone as I left my parents' driveway. It was an urgent email from David, my real estate attorney. I had casually mentioned to him about a month ago that I might consider testing the housing market if the inventory stayed low in my area, but I had never formally listed the property or put a sign in the yard. I opened the message. The subject line read simply, "Unsolicited cash offer." I scanned the text, my professional instincts immediately kicking into high gear. David explained that an anonymous corporate entity listed only as a private LLC had submitted a direct formal offer to purchase my home. I blinked, reading the numbers twice to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me in the dark car. The offer was 10% above the current market value. It was an all-cash transaction, no mortgage contingencies, no structural inspections. And the most shocking detail of all was the timeline. The buyer was requesting an immediate, expedited 48-hour closing. I sat in the quiet of my car, the dashboard lights casting a soft blue glow across my face as I processed the information. In real estate, an offer like this was a total unicorn. It was aggressive, decisive, and completely unheard of for a residential townhouse in this area. Someone wanted this property desperately, and they had the liquid capital to bypass the entire traditional process. A small part of my analytical brain wondered who was behind the anonymous LLC. But the larger, more pragmatic part of me recognized the absolute perfection of the timing. My family had given me an ultimatum to surrender my home to Camille by Monday. It was currently Thursday night. A 48-hour closing meant that by Saturday evening, the house would no longer legally belong to me anyway. I grabbed my purse, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and walked up to my front porch. Just as I unlocked my front door and stepped into the entryway, my phone chimed loudly with a text message. I kicked off my heels, locked the deadbolt behind me, and glanced at the bright screen. It was from Jamal. I opened the message and felt a sudden sharp spike of irritation pierce through my calm exterior. Jamal had sent me a photograph of my own living room. He must have taken it during one of their brief, uninvited drop-ins last month when my mother dragged them over for a forced family visit. But the image had been crudely altered. Using some cheap photo editing application on his phone, he had virtually erased my custom velvet sofa, my antique coffee table, and the beautiful built-in bookshelves I had commissioned from a local artisan. In their place, he had digitally drawn in a massive tacky entertainment center and a wet bar that looked like it belonged in a cheap nightclub. He even added a digital sticker of a popping champagne bottle in the corner. Beneath the butchered photo of my sanctuary was a message that radiated pure, unadulterated entitlement. Just getting a head start on the vision board for the new place, the text read, "Make sure you have all your boxes packed and the floors broom swept by Sunday night. Camille is highly allergic to dust, and we have a contractor coming first thing Monday morning to knock down that useless wall between the kitchen and the dining area. Thanks for the housewarming gift, sis." I stood in the middle of my beautiful living room staring at the screen. The absolute audacity of this man. He contributed nothing to society, lived entirely off his wife's inflated corporate salary and my parents' dwindling savings, and he was now issuing commands about a home he was trying to steal for pennies on the dollar. He was already measuring the drapes for a house he did not own. They honestly believed I was broken. They believed that decades of emotional manipulation had conditioned me to just roll over, surrender my greatest financial asset, and absorb their abuse simply because we shared the same bloodline. They thought the fear of losing a broke family would force me to sign away my security. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and leaned against the granite countertop. All the anger I had felt moments ago distilled into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I did not type an angry response to Jamal. I did not try to explain the boundaries he was crossing or demand respect. As a professional who deals with corporate fraudsters all the time, I know that responding to toxic people only gives them the ammunition and the attention they crave. Instead, I simply took a screenshot of his ridiculous message. I opened my email application and navigated back to the message from David. I hit reply. I did not ask any questions about the anonymous buyer. I did not try to negotiate the already exorbitant price. I typed a single definitive word in the body of the email. Yes. Then I attached the screenshot of Jamal's text message to the email thread, with a quick follow-up instruction. David, please fast-track this closing. Accept the cash offer from the LLC immediately. Draft the paperwork tonight and send it over to me. Do whatever it takes to ensure the deed transfers by Saturday afternoon. My family thinks they already own the property, and they are making plans to demolish my kitchen. Let's show them exactly who holds the power. I hit send, set my phone face down on the marble counter, and smiled into the quiet, empty house. The game was officially on. Friday morning began with a quiet sense of victory. I sat at my kitchen island sipping black coffee and watching the sunrise illuminate the very living room my family was currently conspiring to destroy. My laptop was open, displaying a secure email from David, my real estate attorney. He had worked late into the night. The anonymous corporate buyer had already wired the full purchase amount into an escrow account. The funds were verified, the paperwork was drafted, and David assured me that the title transfer would be officially recorded by the end of the business day. By the time my family woke up on Saturday morning, this house would legally belong to a total stranger. I closed my laptop, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, debating whether I should even answer. I knew the golden rule of dealing with toxic people was to cut all contact, but my professional curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what their next move was. I swiped the screen and accepted the call. Nia, my father said, his voice completely stripped of the booming rage he had displayed at the dinner table the night before. Listen, your mother and I want to apologize. Things got entirely out of hand last night. Emotions were high. We want to take you out for a quick apology lunch near your office downtown. We need to make things right before the weekend. I knew my father well. Warren did not apologize. He strategized. Every single time he lowered his voice and played the peacemaker, it meant he was setting a trap. But knowing that the sale of my house was already fully secured and entirely out of his control, I felt completely untouchable. I decided to play along. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go to steal my property. I agreed to meet them at noon. He gave me an address on a busy downtown street. When I arrived, I quickly realized we were not meeting at a restaurant. The address belonged to a tired, poorly maintained commercial office building squeezed between a parking garage and a discount convenience store. The directory in the lobby listed a firm called Caldwell Legal Services on the 3rd floor. I rode the creaky elevator up my leather briefcase, gripped firmly in my hand. I walked into a cramped reception area that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. There was no receptionist, just a closed door at the end of a short hallway. I knocked once and opened it without waiting for an answer. My father and mother were sitting across a cheap laminate conference table. Next to them sat a man in a wrinkled gray suit who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. He had thin hair, nervous eyes, and a forced, unnatural smile. This was clearly not an apology lunch. This was a legal ambush. "Welcome, Nia," my father said, his voice cold and commanding. "Have a seat. Mr. Caldwell here represents the family." I did not sit down. I stood perfectly still, resting my briefcase on the edge of the table. I looked at my mother, Denise, who was aggressively inspecting her manicured fingernails, completely avoiding my gaze. "Where is Jamal?" I asked mildly, noticing my cowardly brother-in-law was absent from this little shakedown. "He is busy picking out paint colors for the living room," Denise snapped, finally looking up with a glare. "Now sit down and listen to the lawyer." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and slid a thick manila folder across the table toward me. Inside is a promissory note, Caldwell stated, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "It details the $60,000 loan your parents provided to you 5 years ago for the down payment on your townhouse. Since you have failed to make any regular payments on this substantial loan, your parents are legally calling in the debt." He tapped his plastic pen against the folder. "Your parents are willing to forgive this massive debt entirely, provided you sign the deed of the house over to your sister Camille by Monday morning. If you refuse this generous offer, they will file a massive fraud lawsuit against you." My mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "We do not want to destroy your career, Nia," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But you forced our hand. You are being incredibly selfish. If we have to go to court, it will be very public. Warren will have to call the state licensing board and report you for financial elder abuse. You will lose your forensic accounting firm. You will lose every single corporate client you have. Just sign the house over to your sister, and we can all go back to being a happy family." I stared at the 3 of them. I was a certified forensic accountant. I spent my days tearing apart complex offshore tax evasion schemes and analyzing millions of dollars in corporate embezzlement. I built my firm from the ground up, earning the trust of the biggest corporations in the city. And my parents honestly thought they could intimidate me with a small-time sleazy lawyer and a fabricated story. I slowly reached out and opened the folder. I looked down at the document. It was deeply offensive how poorly constructed it was. The date at the top was completely wrong. The notary stamp looked suspiciously like it had been printed from a cheap home inkjet printer, the ink slightly blurred around the edges. But the most hilarious part was the signature at the bottom. It was a laughable attempt at mimicking my handwriting. They had literally traced my signature, likely from an old birthday card I had given my mother years ago. The loops were entirely wrong and the pressure of the pen was completely inconsistent. I did not scream. I did not cry. I calmly opened my leather briefcase and pulled out my iPad. I typed in my complex passcode and opened my encrypted financial archives. I turned the bright screen toward Mr. Caldwell and my parents. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the glowing display. That is the official, certified bank record from 5 years ago, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. It shows a direct wire transfer of $60,000 from my own business operating account directly to the real estate escrow company. There was no loan from you, Dad. In fact, on that exact date, your personal bank accounts were overdrawn by $2,000 because you had just paid the deposit on Camille's luxury car lease. I tapped the screen again, bringing up a high-resolution scan of the forged document they had just handed me. Furthermore, Mr. Caldwell, if you attempt to file this fabricated document in any court of law, I will personally see to it that you are disbarred and prosecuted for submitting forged evidence. The signature on your paper loops the letter N backward. I have never signed my name like that in my entire life. You are holding a felony in your hands. Mr. Caldwell turned completely pale. He dropped his pen and looked at my father, his eyes wide with panic, clearly realizing he had been lied to and was now risking his own legal license for a quick payday. Warren's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the cheap plastic water cups, recreating his explosive temper tantrum from Thanksgiving dinner. "You arrogant little brat!" he yelled, standing up from his chair. "You think you are so smart. You think you can talk your way out of this. Camille has already secured the funding to buy your house. She has the cash ready to transfer today. We are trying to do this the easy way to save you the public humiliation." My father snatched the folder back from my side of the table. But in his blind rage, he pulled it too quickly. The papers inside shifted, and a second document underneath the fake promissory note slid out into the open, resting right in front of me. It was a proof of funds certificate, a standard financial document Camille must have provided to them to prove she had the $150,000 ready for the forced purchase. I glanced down at the certificate before my father could cover it up. My eyes instantly locked onto the routing number and the originating account information printed clearly at the top of the page. The breath suddenly caught in my throat. As a forensic auditor, my brain is trained to memorize massive amounts of financial data, especially for the high-profile clients I represent. I stared at the numbers on the page, my mind racing at light speed. That routing number did not belong to Camille's personal savings account. It did not belong to a standard bank loan or a wealthy friend. It belonged to the corporate marketing budget of the exact company Camille worked for. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The very company Camille worked for had just been acquired by Xavier, a powerful, no-nonsense CEO who had ironically just hired my auditing firm to investigate deep financial discrepancies in his newly acquired assets. Camille was not just a spoiled golden child trying to steal my house. She was actively committing massive corporate embezzlement. She was stealing $150,000 directly from Xavier's corporation to fund her lifestyle, and my parents, in their desperate attempt to threaten me, had just handed me the smoking gun. I slid the proof of funds certificate back across the cheap laminate table, making sure my face revealed absolutely nothing. Mr. Caldwell was still pale, staring at the forged promissory note like it might suddenly catch fire. My father was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, as he waited for me to break down and surrender. Instead, I simply locked my iPad, slipped it into my briefcase, and snapped the brass clasps shut. The sharp click echoed loudly in the cramped, stale room. "I think we are done here," I said quietly. My mother opened her mouth to hurl another insult, her face twisting into an ugly sneer, but I was already walking out the door. I did not run, and I did not look back. I strode down the hallway, stepped into the elevator, and rode it down to the lobby in total silence. The moment I stepped out of the building and the heavy glass doors closed behind me, a massive wave of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. My hands were practically buzzing. My family had thought they were executing a masterstroke of manipulation, but in their sheer arrogance and utter incompetence, they had just handed me the exact coordinates to destroy Camille's entire life. I got into my car and drove straight to my office in the financial district. My firm occupied half of the 12th floor of a beautiful modern high-rise, a space I had leased and furnished with the profits of my own relentless hard work. The office was quiet because it was a Friday afternoon, and most of my staff had already left for the weekend. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, went directly into my private office, and locked the door behind me. I dropped my briefcase on the leather sofa, sat down at my massive desk, and woke up my multi-monitor computer setup. As a forensic accountant, my mind operates in ledgers, transaction histories, and digital footprints. Fraud always leaves a trail no matter how clever the criminal thinks they are. I logged into my secured databases, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I pulled up the public corporate filings for the marketing agency where Camille was the vice president. I knew from the financial news cycle that her agency had recently been acquired by a massive global holding company headed by a CEO named Xavier. Xavier was known in the industry as a ruthless, highly intelligent operator who specialized in buying bloated companies and immediately auditing them to cut out corruption and waste. I started cross-referencing the routing and account numbers I had memorized from that proof of funds certificate. I accessed the state business registry and began tracing the digital breadcrumbs. Within 45 minutes, the entire fraudulent architecture appeared clearly on my screens. It was breathtakingly sloppy. Camille had exploited her executive clearance to bypass the newly implemented financial freezes Xavier had put in place during the acquisition. She had set up a dummy corporation, registering it as a boutique digital media vendor. Then she had generated a series of fake invoices for advertising services that were never actually rendered. She pushed these fraudulent invoices through the accounts payable department, abusing her seniority to skip the secondary authorization protocols. The total amount she had siphoned into her dummy vendor account over the last 3 weeks was exactly $150,000. She had moved the stolen corporate funds into a private escrow holding account, perfectly positioning the money to be wired as a cash payment for my townhouse. She was literally trying to convert stolen company money into clean real estate equity, using her own sister as the unwitting vehicle for money laundering. My parents had absolutely no idea. They just saw their golden child wielding cash and assumed she was wildly successful. They were so blinded by their favoritism that they never stopped to question why a woman who leased expensive cars and carried massive credit card debt suddenly had $150,000 in liquid cash to buy a house on a random Thursday. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing monitors. I had her. I had the exact dates, the exact transaction numbers, and the undeniable proof of corporate embezzlement. I reached for my phone, intending to call David, my real estate attorney, to confirm that the anonymous LLC had finalized the purchase of my home. But before I could unlock the screen, the phone began to ring in my hand. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. Normally, I let unknown numbers go straight to voicemail, but my instincts told me to answer. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. "This is Nia," I answered professionally. "Nia." "Good afternoon," a deep, incredibly calm voice replied. "My name is Xavier. I am the CEO of the corporation that currently owns your sister's marketing firm. I also happen to be the anonymous buyer who just legally closed on your beautiful townhouse about 20 minutes ago." I froze. The silence stretched for a few seconds as my brain rapidly processed this massive collision of worlds. The anonymous corporate LLC, the lightning-fast all-cash offer, the absolute refusal to negotiate. It had not been a random real estate investor looking for a quick flip. It had been Xavier all along. "I am listening, Xavier," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, though a small smile began to form on my lips. I imagine you are currently sitting in your office putting the pieces together. Xavier continued his tone, carrying a note of genuine respect. I am very familiar with your professional reputation, Nia. In fact, my executive team was preparing to reach out to your forensic accounting firm next week to handle our internal corporate audits. You are known for being meticulous. That is why I know I do not have to explain the concept of asset freezing to you. Please tell me your side of the board, I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my desk. When my company acquired Camille Agency last month, I immediately initiated a standard financial review, Xavier explained. It did not take long for my internal team to flag some glaring discrepancies in the marketing budget. Camille was careless. We noticed the funds bleeding into a dummy vendor account. I hired a private investigation firm to quietly track where the money was going. I wanted to see the full scope of her fraud before I brought down the hammer. Xavier paused, and I could hear the faint sound of a siren passing by his window on the other end of the line. My investigators tracked the money to a real estate escrow account, he said, and then they tracked the target property to you. When my team ran a background check and realized the target was the sister's own home, we dug deeper. We observed the family dynamics. We saw that you were being coerced and threatened into a forced sale. Camille was attempting to launder my stolen capital by forcefully acquiring your asset at a severely deflated price. So you bought it first. I concluded, the sheer brilliance of his strategy washing over me. Exactly, Xavier said. If I had simply frozen the stolen funds, Camille would have panicked and potentially destroyed evidence, and your family would have continued to harass you. By creating an anonymous LLC and offering you an unrejectable cash amount for an immediate closing, I accomplished two things. First, I legally secured the property, ensuring Camille could not finalize her money laundering scheme. Second, I removed you from the line of fire. The house now belongs to my corporate holdings, and your equity is safely in your bank account, completely out of your toxic family's reach. I looked at the bank tab open on one of my monitors. He was right. The full purchase amount, 10% over my asking price, had officially cleared into my personal accounts. I was completely liquid and completely free. The trap is fully set, Xavier said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of impending justice. Camille believes she is closing on the house tomorrow morning. She believes she has won. I have already contacted the local authorities and handed over the complete investigative file, including the wire fraud evidence. The police are fully briefed and ready to move. A profound sense of vindication settled deep in my chest. For 35 years, I had watched my parents enable Camille's worst behaviors. I had watched them excuse her cruelty, fund her arrogance, and demand that I shrink myself to make her feel bigger. They had pushed me out, threatened my livelihood, and tried to steal the one place in the world that brought me peace. And now the universe had orchestrated the most perfect, devastating counterstrike imaginable. I am arriving at the property tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, Xavier continued. I am going to personally inform your sister that she is trespassing on corporate property right before the police arrest her for felony embezzlement. He paused, and I could practically hear the smirk in his voice. I know it is your weekend, Nia, but considering everything your family has put you through, I wanted to extend a personal invitation. Do you want to be there when I drop the hammer? I looked out the massive window of my office, watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the evening sky. I thought about the fake promissory note. I thought about Jamal's photoshopped picture of my living room. I thought about my father telling me I was no longer part of the family. I smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I would not miss it for the world, Xavier, I replied smoothly. Let them pack first. After hanging up with Xavier, I immediately initiated the first phase of my own personal protocol: total radio silence. I turned off my email notifications and switched my personal cell phone to Do Not Disturb. I knew exactly how my family operated. They thrived on conflict, feeding off the energy of resistance. By giving them absolute silence, I was handing them a blank canvas to project their own arrogance onto. As I packed up my briefcase and left my downtown office, the notifications continued to silently stack up on my locked screen. My father had called 4 times. My mother had texted a barrage of passive-aggressive threats thinly veiled as maternal concern. But the most telling messages came from Camille. Without any pushback from me, she had naturally assumed I had broken under the pressure of their legal ambush. She sent me a text at 6 o'clock that simply read, "Glad you finally realized you had no other choice. See you this weekend." I drove through the city streets as the sun set, feeling a profound sense of detachment. For my entire life, an onslaught of messages from my family would have triggered massive anxiety. I would have spent the evening agonizing over how to defend myself, how to explain my side, or how to beg for basic respect. But tonight, their words held absolutely no power. They were screaming into a void, entirely unaware that the ground beneath them had already collapsed. I let them believe they had won. I let them revel in their false victory, knowing that the higher they climbed on their pedestal of delusion, the harder the eventual fall would be. Before returning home to pack, I drove to the upscale legal district to meet David at his office. The transaction had been digitally secured, but there were still final physical handover documents to sign, and I was scheduled to hand over the spare keys to the new legal owner. When I walked into the mahogany-paneled conference room, David was sitting next to a man who commanded the space without having to speak a single word. Xavier stood up as I entered. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, exuding the kind of quiet, absolute authority that Jamal desperately tried and failed to project. We shook hands, and his grip was firm and respectful. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, only the sharp, focused energy of a man who dealt in facts and swift executions. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person," Nia, Xavier said, gesturing for me to sit across from him. "Your reputation for meticulous auditing is well earned, but your ability to maintain composure under this level of familial extortion is truly impressive." We spent the next 30 minutes reviewing the final disclosures. David slid the closing documents across the table, and I signed my name on the dotted line with a heavy, satisfying stroke of the pen. There was no forged signature here. This was the real deal. As David stamped the final seal of approval, my phone vibrated with an automated alert from my private wealth management app. I opened the screen. The escrow account had successfully dispersed the funds. My checking account balance had just swelled by over $700,000, reflecting the cash purchase price of the house minus the minor closing fees. The money was real, it was clean, and it was entirely mine. The townhouse officially and legally belonged to Xavier's corporate holdings. He picked up the set of silver keys I slid across the table and slipped them into his pocket. "The stage is set for tomorrow morning," Xavier confirmed, a sharp, calculating look in his eyes. "My security detail and I will arrive at your former residence precisely at 9 o'clock. Enjoy your evening, Nia." I left the law office and drove back to the townhouse for the very last time. I had anticipated a quick move ever since the Thanksgiving dinner ambush, so I had quietly hired an elite overnight packing service earlier in the week. By the time I walked through the front door, a team of professional movers was already efficiently boxing up my life. They wrapped my custom furniture in thick, protective padding and carefully packed my antique books into heavy-duty crates. I walked through the rooms watching the physical evidence of my life in that house disappear into brown cardboard. While the movers worked, I finally checked my voicemail. There was a new message from my mother, Denise. I pressed play and let her voice echo through the half-empty living room. "Nia, it is your mother." The voicemail began, her tone dripping with a sickly sweet, smug satisfaction. "Your father told me about your little tantrum at the lawyer's office today, but we are glad you finally came to your senses and realized you cannot win this. Camille is booking the premium movers for tomorrow morning. Have all your things out of the house by 8. We do not want your mess getting in the way of her decorators. This is for the best, sweetheart. You will see." I deleted the message with a quick swipe of my thumb. The sheer delusion was almost breathtaking. They were so confident in their ability to crush me that they were practically measuring the drapes while standing on a landmine. Jamal had even posted a public story on his social media tagging the location of my house with the caption, "Upgrading the lifestyle." Moving into our new estate tomorrow? Major renovations incoming. I spent the night directing the movers, ensuring that absolutely nothing of value was left behind. I wanted the house to be completely void of my presence. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the moving trucks were loaded and on their way to a secure climate-controlled storage facility downtown until I officially signed the lease on my new luxury apartment. I walked through the empty rooms with a microfiber cloth and a bottle of multi-surface cleaner. I wiped down the granite countertops in the kitchen. I vacuumed the faint footprints off the carpets. I made sure the house was immaculate, sterile, and perfectly staged. I wanted Camille to walk into a pristine environment, letting her imagination run wild with the possibilities right before it was all ripped away from her. Leaving the house dirty or damaged would have given them a reason to call me bitter. Leaving it flawless was a psychological statement. It said I was unaffected. It said I was already gone. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. The neighborhood was quiet, completely unaware of the corporate and legal storm that was about to touch down. I stood in the empty foyer, my footsteps echoing against the bare hardwood floors. I held my final overnight suitcase in my hand. I took one last look around the space that had been my sanctuary for 5 years. I felt no sadness, only the exhilarating rush of absolute freedom. I stepped out onto the front porch, pulled the heavy wooden door shut, and listened to the deadbolt click into place. I walked down the driveway and loaded the suitcase into the trunk of my car. It was 8:15 in the morning. According to my mother's voicemail, the family circus was scheduled to arrive momentarily. I got into my car and drove exactly 1 block down the street. There was a charming, locally owned coffee shop positioned perfectly on the corner. It had a row of large glass windows that offered a direct, unobstructed view down the tree-lined street, pointing straight at my former driveway. I parked my car, walked inside, and ordered a large black coffee. I chose a high-top table right against the front window, taking a seat and wrapping my hands around the warm paper cup. I checked my watch. The minutes ticked by in a slow, delicious anticipation. I took a sip of my coffee, keeping my eyes locked on the street ahead, waiting for the moving truck to pull up. The morning sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawns of my old street. I sat at the high-top table in the corner coffee shop, the warm paper cup grounding my hands. It was exactly 8:25 when the tranquility of the neighborhood was violently interrupted. The deep, heavy rumble of a massive diesel engine echoed off the surrounding houses. A gigantic premium moving truck painted in bright corporate colors turned the corner and slowly began backing into the driveway of the townhouse I no longer owned. Close behind the moving truck were 2 familiar vehicles. Camille's pristine white luxury SUV pulled up and parked illegally on the curb, followed immediately by my father's silver sedan. I watched through the coffee shop window as the doors swung open. My family stepped out onto the concrete, completely radiating an aura of unearned victory. Camille emerged wearing a brand-new, ridiculously expensive designer athleisure outfit, looking less like someone preparing for a day of heavy lifting and more like someone arriving at a country club brunch. Jamal hopped out of the passenger side wearing dark sunglasses and a smug grin. My parents, Warren and Denise, exited their vehicle with huge, beaming smiles. Jamal reached into the back seat of the SUV and pulled out a bottle of champagne. Right there on the driveway in broad daylight, he popped the cork. The loud pop echoed down the street as the champagne foamed over his hands. The 4 of them burst into loud celebratory laughter, clinking imaginary glasses and admiring the beautiful brick exterior of the house. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves. They genuinely believed they had successfully executed a master plan to crush my independence and steal my primary asset. They thought their threats had terrified me into submission. I stood up from my table, adjusted my coat, and walked out the glass doors of the coffee shop. I carried my coffee cup with me, my steps measured and deliberate. The morning air was crisp, and the leaves crunched softly beneath my boots as I walked the short block toward the house. I felt no anxiety. My heart rate was perfectly steady. The closer I got, the louder their arrogant laughter became. As I reached the edge of the property line, Jamal was the first to notice me. He tapped Camille on the shoulder and pointed in my direction. The laughter instantly died down, replaced by a collective shift in posture. They stood taller, puffing out their chests, ready to assert their dominance over the defeated daughter who was coming to surrender her kingdom. "Well, look who decided to finally show up," Camille sneered, her voice carrying easily over the low hum of the moving truck's idling engine. She crossed her arms over her chest, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against her bicep. I stopped at the bottom of the driveway, planting my feet on the concrete. I did not say a word. I just looked at her, observing the absolute arrogance radiating from her posture. "I told you to have all your garbage out by 8 o'clock. Camille continued, her tone sharp and condescending. "I seriously hope you left the kitchen clean. I have a professional cleaning crew coming this afternoon to sanitize the place before my interior decorator arrives on Monday. Now hand over the keys, Nia. I have a very busy schedule today, and I do not have time to deal with your bitter attitude." Jamal stepped forward, standing right beside his wife to present a united front of entitlement. "Honestly, Nia," he said, shaking his head with mock pity, "you should be thanking us. You were in way over your head with this property. Now you can go rent a nice little apartment downtown. It is tough having to start all over at 35 years old, but maybe this will teach you some humility. We will make sure to invite you over for the holidays, once we fix the place up and make it actually look nice." The absolute absurdity of a man who did not have a job and who lived entirely off stolen corporate funds and my parents' retirement account lecturing me about humility was almost too much to bear. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was slightly bitter, cutting perfectly through the overwhelming sweetness of their delusion. Before I could even formulate a response to Jamal's ridiculous speech, my father inserted himself into the conversation. Warren marched down the driveway, his face set in a stern, authoritative scowl. He stopped a few feet away from me, holding out his open palm like he was demanding lunch money from a grade school child. "Stop stalling, Nia," my father commanded, his voice booming with the fake authority he always used to intimidate me. "Give your sister the keys right now. And while you are at it, you are going to apologize to her." I raised an eyebrow, staring directly into my father's eyes. "Apologize for what exactly?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "For being so unbelievably difficult," my mother, Denise, chimed in, rushing to stand next to my father. She clutched her expensive leather purse against her chest, glaring at me with a look of pure disgust. "You dragged this out all week. You threw a massive tantrum at the lawyer's office yesterday and made a complete fool of yourself in front of Mr. Caldwell. You should be down on your knees thanking us that we decided not to file that fraud lawsuit against you and destroy your little accounting business. We gave you an easy way out, and you still have to show up here with that terrible bad attitude. Hand over the keys and go. You are ruining Camille's big day." I looked at the four of them standing there in a row. My father with his outstretched hand demanding my property. My mother with her hateful glare demanding my gratitude. Jamal with his foolish sunglasses demanding my respect. And Camille, the architect of this entire disaster, standing behind them all with a triumphant, evil little smirk on her face, demanding my absolute surrender. They had pushed me my entire life. They had taken my resources, my energy, and my patience, constantly feeding it into the bottomless pit of Camille's ego. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my professionalism for fear. They had pushed me right to the edge, completely unaware that I had built a brick wall behind me. I lowered my coffee cup. I looked at my father's expectant, outstretched hand, and then I looked up at Camille. Her smirk faltered just a fraction of an inch, likely unsettled by the fact that I was not crying, begging, or screaming. I let out a soft, genuine chuckle. The sound seemed to confuse them, breaking the script they had so carefully rehearsed in their minds. "I do not have the keys, Dad?" I said, my voice ringing out clear and bright in the morning air. My father's face immediately turned red with sudden explosive anger. "What do you mean you do not have the keys?" he yelled, stepping closer to me. "Do not play games with me today, Nia. I will call a locksmith right now and send you the bill." "Where are the keys to this house?" I smiled a wide, relaxed smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the warmth. "You will have to ask the new owner," I replied simply. I raised my free hand and pointed a single finger down the street right past their illegally parked cars. All four of their heads snapped in the direction I was pointing. The confusion on their faces was absolute perfection. Turning the corner at the exact end of the block was a massive, sleek black SUV. Its heavily tinted windows and polished exterior gleamed in the morning sunlight. It moved with a quiet, menacing grace, gliding smoothly down the asphalt toward my former driveway. The vehicle slowed as it approached the property line, pulling up directly behind the massive moving truck and effectively blocking my family in. The heavy engine of the black SUV idled with a low, powerful purr. The four of them stared at the vehicle in total silence, the cheap champagne completely forgotten on the driveway. The driver's side door clicked, and the heavy door slowly began to open. The heavy door of the black SUV swung open completely, and the atmosphere on the street shifted instantly. Two men in crisp, dark suits stepped out first. They were broad-shouldered and moved with the synchronized precision of trained corporate security professionals. They flanked the rear passenger door, standing at absolute attention. Then Xavier stepped out onto the asphalt. He looked immaculate. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that instantly made Jamal's flashy, ill-fitting clothes look like a cheap Halloween costume. Xavier buttoned his suit jacket with a single fluid motion and looked slowly around the property before locking his piercing gaze directly onto my sister. I watched Camille's face closely. The transformation was absolute and instantaneous. The smug, triumphant smile she had worn just seconds ago was entirely wiped away. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and pale under the bright morning sun. She took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over her own expensive designer sneakers. She recognized him immediately. To my parents and Jamal, this was just a mysterious, wealthy man interrupting their victory parade. But to Camille, this was the absolute apex predator of her corporate ecosystem. The man who signed her paychecks and controlled her entire professional existence was now standing in my driveway. Camille opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, stuttering sound came out. She swallowed hard, frantically, trying to arrange her panicked features into a mask of polite professionalism. "Mr. Xavier," she stammered, her voice trembling so badly it was almost unrecognizable. "Sir, what an unexpected surprise. What are you doing here at my new home? Are you here for the neighborhood association? I did not know you lived in this area." Before Xavier could even acknowledge her pathetic attempt at corporate pleasantries, Jamal stepped forward. Jamal had absolutely no idea who this man was, but his fragile ego could not handle another man commanding the attention of his wife and dominating the physical space. Jamal puffed out his chest aggressively, crossing his arms as he marched toward the end of the driveway to defend what he mistakenly thought was his territory. "Hey, man," Jamal barked, his voice loud and confrontational. "I do not care what kind of fancy car you drive, you are blocking my moving truck. This is private property. We are trying to move into our new estate today, and you are trespassing. Move the car right now before we have a serious problem." Xavier did not even blink. He did not flinch, and he certainly did not look intimidated by Jamal's ridiculous posturing. In fact, Xavier completely ignored Jamal's existence. He treated Jamal like a mildly annoying gust of wind. Xavier bypassed him entirely, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the concrete as he walked directly up to Camille. Jamal stood there, his mouth slightly open, completely neutralized by the sheer gravity of Xavier's presence. Xavier reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder, holding it out toward my sister. Camille stared at the folder like it was a live explosive. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely lift them to take it. The crisp paper rustled slightly in the morning breeze. "This is not your home," Camille Xavier said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deep, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence from everyone on the driveway. Even the moving crew had stopped, completely pausing with heavy boxes in their hands to watch the drama unfold from the back of their truck. "I bought this property on Thursday afternoon, in an all-cash transaction." Xavier continued, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. "And according to the forensic audit contained in that folder, you were attempting to use $150,000 of stolen company funds to illegally acquire this asset from your sister." The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Stolen company funds, illegally acquire, forensic audit. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. The dark roast tasted incredible. I watched as my mother's jaw dropped open in horror. Denise looked from Xavier to Camille, waiting for her golden child to laugh and explain that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Camille could not speak. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly around the street as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. Jamal suddenly looked much smaller. His puffed-out chest deflated instantly as the crushing realization hit him. The arrogant swagger he had carried all morning evaporated. He turned to Camille, his eyes wide behind his expensive sunglasses. "Camille, what is he talking about?" Jamal asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What stolen funds? You told me your parents gave you the cash for the house. You said this was a legitimate transfer." Camille ignored her husband entirely. Tears of sheer panic welled up in her eyes as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. "Mr. Xavier, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. "We can handle this internally. I can explain everything to you. It was just a temporary reallocation of marketing resources. I was going to put the money back before the quarterly review. Please let us just go into the office on Monday and discuss this privately. I have been a loyal employee for years." "A temporary reallocation," Xavier repeated, his voice dripping with icy, undeniable contempt. "You created a dummy media vendor, generated fraudulent invoices, and bypassed secondary executive authorization to siphon $150,000 into a private escrow account. You committed felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. There is absolutely nothing to discuss privately. You are officially terminated from your position as Vice President of Marketing, effective immediately." The word terminated echoed like a gunshot in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Camille's knees buckled slightly, and she had to lean against the side of her luxury SUV to keep from collapsing onto the concrete. The shiny facade she had spent her entire life building was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her family. At the sound of the word terminated, my father finally snapped out of his stunned silence. Warren could not comprehend a reality where his perfect daughter was a criminal. In his mind, Camille was a perpetual victim, a shining star, and everyone else in the world was just conspiring against her success. He had spent decades enabling her terrible behavior, and his brain simply refused to accept the undeniable truth standing right in front of him. Warren marched aggressively down the driveway, inserting his large frame between Xavier and Camille. His face was purple with rage, completely abandoning any sense of logic, reason, or decorum. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Xavier's chest. "Now you listen here," Warren yelled, spit flying from his lips as he raised his voice to an embarrassing volume. "I do not care who you think you are or what kind of fake paperwork you brought here to intimidate my family. My daughter is a highly successful executive. She is a good person. You are standing here on a Saturday morning making outrageous defamatory accusations to ruin her reputation. She earned the money to buy this house fair and square. You and Nia orchestrated this entire disgusting setup just to humiliate her because Nia has always been insanely jealous of her sister." My father reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out his cell phone, waving it wildly in the air like a weapon. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with misplaced paternal rage. I am giving you exactly 5 seconds to get back into your little black car and drive away from my daughter's property. Warren threatened, his voice echoing loudly down the street, drawing the attention of several neighbors who were now peeking out of their front doors. If you do not leave this property immediately, I am calling the police. I will have you arrested for criminal harassment and trespassing, and I will personally sue your company for everything it is worth. I will ruin you. Warren glared at Xavier, fully expecting the CEO to back down in the face of his aggressive tantrum. My father thought he was the loudest, most intimidating man in the room, just like he always did at the Thanksgiving dinner table. He thought volume equated to power, but Xavier did not step back. He did not look angry, and he certainly did not look afraid. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, looked my father dead in the eye with a chilling, absolute calm, and delivered the final blow. I already did. The words hung in the air, freezing my father right in his tracks. I already did. Xavier repeated, his voice perfectly measured. He did not blink. He simply opened the thick manila folder he had been holding out to my sister. The crisp sound of the paper turning felt deafening in the sudden absolute silence of the driveway. My father's hand slowly lowered from mid-air. The cell phone he had been wildly waving around suddenly looked very heavy. He glanced nervously down the street, as if expecting a fleet of squad cars to materialize out of thin air. Xavier did not wait for my family to recover from the shock. He looked down at the top sheet of the audit report and began to read aloud, completely dismantling Camille's carefully constructed life, piece by piece. On October 12th, you authorized a wire transfer of $45,000 from the newly acquired marketing budget to a vendor listed as Apex Digital Media Solutions. Xavier stated, his voice ringing out with crystal clarity. On October 28th, a second transfer of $60,000. And finally, on November 5th, just 3 days ago, a final transfer of $45,000, a total of exactly $150,000. Xavier looked up from the paper, his dark eyes locking onto Camille, who was now trembling so violently she had to grip the side mirror of her luxury SUV just to stay upright. Apex Digital Media Solutions does not exist. Xavier continued, stepping one pace closer to her. It is a shell company registered to a post office box 2 towns over. A post office box registered under your maiden name. You bypassed the secondary executive authorization protocols by classifying these transfers as emergency media buys. You then moved the entire sum into a private escrow account yesterday morning, intending to use my corporate capital to illegally force your sister out of her home. The 2 security guards standing behind Xavier remained perfectly still, their presence a silent, terrifying reminder that this was not a family dispute. This was a corporate execution. I stood on the edge of the driveway, taking another slow sip of my coffee. The neighbors who had been peeking out from behind their curtains were now openly standing on their front porches watching the spectacle. The movers had completely abandoned their tasks, sitting on the tailgate of the massive truck, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. My mother, Denise, could not handle the public humiliation. The idea that her neighbors were watching her perfect family being exposed as common criminals broke her brain. She rushed forward, stepping in front of Camille, attempting to shield her golden child from the harsh reality of the situation. "Now wait just a minute," Denise said, plastering on a fake, overly bright smile that looked absolutely deranged under the circumstances. "This is all just a terrible family misunderstanding, a simple miscommunication about a loan. You see, Mr. Xavier, we are a very respectable family. We have lived in this community for decades. Camille just borrowed that money temporarily to help secure this property. We were always going to pay it back. There is no need for the police or these ugly accusations. Let us all just step inside, have a cup of coffee, and sort this out like civilized adults." Xavier closed the folder with a sharp snap. The fake smile on my mother's face twitched. "We will not be stepping inside," Xavier replied coldly, "because this property belongs to my holding company. And there is no misunderstanding, Mrs. Denise. I am fully aware of exactly how this family operates." He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for my parents to see. I recognized it instantly. It was a high-resolution copy of the forged promissory note they had tried to use against me in the lawyer's office yesterday afternoon. I had securely transmitted a copy of it to Xavier last night as part of my official forensic audit report. "This is a fraudulent promissory note," Xavier announced, making sure his voice carried to Jamal and my father. "You and your husband presented this to Nia yesterday at Caldwell Legal Services. You attempted to extort her into signing over the deed to this house by threatening her with a fabricated debt and a fake signature. Do you understand what that means? It means you are not just bystanders in your daughter's embezzlement scheme. By actively conspiring to force the sale of this property to secure the stolen funds, you have established a documented paper trail of premeditated fraud and extortion. You are accomplices." The blood drained entirely from my mother's face. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked at my father, who was suddenly speechless, his usual booming arrogance completely neutralized by the undeniable proof of his own criminal liability. They had spent their entire lives manipulating situations and bullying their way out of consequences, but they could not bully a forensic paper trail, and they certainly could not bully Xavier. The word accomplices hung heavy in the crisp morning air. And that was the exact moment the rats began to turn on each other. Jamal had been standing near the back of the white SUV, his face pale and his eyes darting frantically between Xavier, the forged document, and his wife. Jamal was a parasite. He had married Camille for her status and her income, happily turning a blind eye to her massive credit card debt, as long as she kept buying him expensive watches and leasing him luxury cars. But Jamal was also a coward. The realization that he was standing in the middle of a federal wire fraud conspiracy and that his name might be attached to the illegal purchase of the house shattered his fragile loyalty in a split second. Jamal aggressively pushed himself away from the SUV, putting as much physical distance between himself and Camille as possible. He threw his hands up in the air, shaking his head violently. Whoa, wait a minute," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this. Do not look at me. I did not know anything about any stolen corporate money. I did not sign any forged papers." Jamal pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife, the woman he had promised to love and protect just a few years ago at a lavish $250,000 wedding funded by my parents. "She lied to me," Jamal yelled, throwing Camille completely under the bus without a single ounce of hesitation. "She handles all the finances. She told me she got a massive bonus at work and that her parents were giving us the rest of the cash. I just showed up today to move the furniture. I am a victim here. She lied to all of us. I want absolutely nothing to do with her or this house." The sheer speed of Jamal's betrayal was breathtaking. He was practically tripping over his own feet trying to back away from the blast radius of Camille's imploding life. Just 10 minutes ago, he had been sipping champagne on my driveway, mocking me for being a single woman who had to start over at 35. Now he was begging a stranger to believe he was just an innocent bystander, ready to abandon his wife to save his own skin. Camille whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute shock and devastating heartbreak. The golden child, who had always been protected, pampered, and defended by everyone around her, was suddenly standing entirely alone. "Jamal, how could you?" Camille shrieked, her voice shattering into a hysterical sob. "You knew we could not afford this house. You knew we were drowning in debt. You pushed me to get this place so you could have a custom wet bar to show off to your useless friends. You are abandoning me." "I am not going to prison for your stupid mistakes," Camille, Jamal fired back, taking another huge step away from her. "We are done. I am calling my lawyer right now." Camille's entire world was collapsing. Her job was gone. Her reputation was destroyed. Her husband was publicly leaving her on the front lawn of the neighborhood. Her parents were paralyzed by the threat of their own criminal charges, completely unable to save her. Her brain simply could not process the magnitude of the consequences she had brought upon herself. So she did what she had always done her entire life whenever she faced a problem. She looked for someone else to blame. Camille slowly turned her head and locked eyes with me. I was still standing calmly at the edge of the driveway holding my coffee cup watching her house of cards burn to the ground. The sight of my absolute peace contrasted with her total destruction snapped the last remaining thread of her sanity. Her sadness instantly mutated into a blinding, rabid fury. Her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "This is your fault," Camille screamed, the sound tearing violently from her throat. "You planned this. You set me up. If you had just given me the house like you were supposed to, none of this would be happening. You ruined my life." She lunged forward, her hands curled into claws, charging down the concrete driveway directly toward me. She wanted to physically tear the calm expression right off my face. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched her come. Xavier's two corporate security guards instantly stepped forward to intercept her, their massive frames moving with terrifying speed to block her path. But before Camille could even reach them, a new sound pierced the morning air. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but within seconds it multiplied and amplified, echoing off the brick facades of the suburban homes. The unmistakable piercing shriek of approaching police sirens. And they were coming fast. The piercing sound of the sirens grew exponentially louder, bouncing off the manicured lawns and brick facades of the quiet neighborhood. Camille froze mid-lunge. The blind fury that had just contorted her face was instantly washed away by a sudden paralyzing wave of cold reality. The two corporate security guards did not even need to physically touch her. The sheer volume of the approaching police vehicles acted like an invisible wall, stopping her dead in her tracks. Red and blue lights began to aggressively flash, casting harsh, strobing reflections against the white paint of Camille's luxury SUV and the large corporate logo on the side of the moving truck. Two local police cruisers rounded the corner at high speed, their tires screeching loudly against the asphalt as they sharply turned into my former driveway. They positioned their heavy vehicles at sharp angles, effectively barricading the entire property. The massive moving truck was completely boxed in. There was absolutely no way out for anyone. The suburban tranquility of the street was officially shattered. Doors were opening all the way down the block. Neighbors I had politely waved to for the past 5 years were now standing on their front porches. Some cautiously stepped onto their lawns with their arms crossed over their chests, while others openly held up their smartphones to record the spectacle. The moving crew, realizing they were suddenly standing in the middle of a massive legal incident, slowly backed away from the truck. They lowered their heavy boxes to the grass and put their hands in their pockets, clearly signaling to the arriving officers that they were just hired help and had absolutely nothing to do with the unfolding disaster. 4 police officers stepped out of the cruisers. They moved with a serious, coordinated urgency, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts as they quickly assessed the chaotic scene on the driveway. They saw my father breathing heavily with his fists clenched, my mother crying hysterically, Jamal sweating profusely in his designer sunglasses, and Camille standing frozen in absolute terror. Before the officers could even issue a verbal command to secure the area, Xavier stepped forward. He moved with the calm, unshakable confidence of a man who was entirely in control of the narrative. He raised his hands slightly to show he was unarmed and approached the lead officer with purposeful strides. "Good morning, officers," Xavier said, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the remaining echo of the sirens. "My name is Xavier. I am the chief executive officer of the holding company that recently acquired the marketing firm where this woman is employed. I am the individual who filed the corporate fraud report with your precinct earlier this morning." Xavier handed the thick manila folder directly to the lead officer. "Inside that folder you will find the complete forensic audit, the forged vendor invoices, and the bank routing numbers proving extensive wire fraud. As the legal representative of the corporation, I am officially pressing full charges for corporate embezzlement and felony theft against Camille." The lead officer opened the folder, quickly scanning the top document. He noted the meticulously organized financial evidence, nodded once at Xavier, and turned his attention directly to my sister. He gestured for two of his deputies to move forward and secure the suspect. Camille, you are the primary suspect named in this federal wire fraud complaint, the lead officer stated firmly, walking slowly toward her. I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. Camille began to hyperventilate. The polished, arrogant executive persona she had worn like a suit of armor her entire life was completely gone. In its place was a terrified, trembling child who was finally facing a consequence she could not manipulate her parents into fixing. No, wait, please, Camille pleaded, taking a shaky step backward until her back hit the side of the moving truck. You cannot do this right now. You do not understand the situation. I am a vice president of marketing. I have a perfectly clean record. This is just a private corporate matter between me and my boss. Let me call my lawyer. Let me explain it to him. The officers did not negotiate with her. They moved swiftly and professionally, completely immune to her desperate bargaining. One officer firmly grasped her left arm while the other grabbed her right. They swiftly turned her around, pressing her chest up against the bright aluminum siding of the massive moving truck. The thud of her designer athleisure outfit hitting the metal echoed across the quiet driveway. The sharp metallic ratcheting click of the handcuffs closing tightly around her wrists sounded like the most beautiful, vindicating symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. The physical sight of the golden child being placed in cold steel handcuffs completely broke my parents. The protective delusion they had lived inside for 3 decades was violently torn away, but instead of accepting reality, they doubled down on their absolute denial. My father, Warren, completely lost whatever tiny fraction of his mind he had left. He lunged forward, his face turning an alarming shade of dark purple as he screamed at the police officers. "What do you think you are doing?" Warren roared, his voice cracking with misplaced authority. "Take those cuffs off my daughter right this second. You are making a massive mistake. She is not a criminal. She is a highly successful businesswoman. That man in the suit is lying to you to ruin her career." Warren tried to physically step between the arresting officers and Camille, but one of the deputies instantly stepped into his path. The deputy raised a firm hand and pointed a stern, uncompromising finger directly at my father's chest. "Step back right now, sir," the deputy commanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous, authoritative warning. "If you interfere with this lawful arrest, you will be placed in handcuffs next for obstruction of justice. Back away immediately." My father froze in his tracks. His chest heaved and his fists remained clenched in impotent rage. He was so used to yelling his way to victory in our household, but his aggressive suburban dad intimidation tactics were absolutely useless against armed law enforcement officers. Seeing her husband neutralized, my mother, Denise, descended into total unhinged hysterics. She fell to her knees right there on the concrete driveway, sobbing wildly and clutching her expensive leather purse tightly to her chest. She looked like a woman starring in a terribly overacted daytime soap opera. "Please, officers, you have to listen to me," Denise wailed, tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. "She is a good girl. She just bought this beautiful house today. We are a good, upstanding family. Why are you doing this to us on a Saturday morning? It is just a misunderstanding about a loan. You cannot take her to jail in front of all these people. What will the neighbors think?" I stood by the edge of the lawn, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Even as her daughter was being arrested for a massive federal crime, my mother's primary concern was still keeping up appearances for the neighbors. It was a staggering display of toxic vanity. She reached a shaking, desperate hand out toward Camille. Camille was now sobbing uncontrollably against the side of the moving truck, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick, dark streaks. "Mom, do something," Camille cried out, her voice muffled against the cold metal. "Dad, do not let them take me away. Call somebody. Call the mayor. Do something to stop this." While my parents were screaming and Camille was crying, I noticed a subtle movement out of the corner of my eye. Jamal was executing his cowardly escape plan. He had slowly backed away from the white SUV while the police were focused on handcuffing his wife. He was now trying to quietly walk down the very edge of the front lawn, hoping the loud chaos of his in-laws would provide enough cover for him to slip away unnoticed. He had his head down, his hands jammed deep into his pockets, walking briskly toward the end of the block. He almost made it. "Hey, you in the sunglasses!" a sharp, commanding voice called out. Jamal froze instantly. One of the officers who had been tasked with securing the outer perimeter noticed his sudden, highly suspicious departure. The officer walked purposefully over to Jamal, shining a small tactical flashlight directly into Jamal's face, despite the bright morning sun. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" the officer asked, stepping squarely into Jamal's path and blocking his exit. "I am just leaving," Jamal stammered, raising his hands defensively in the air. "I have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I just came over here to help move some heavy boxes. I am calling an Uber right now and going home." The officer did not move an inch. "I need to see your government identification, sir," the officer demanded, holding out his expectant hand. "I do not have to show you anything," Jamal argued, his voice pitching high with nervous panic. "I did not commit any crimes here today. That is my wife over there by the truck, and she handles all of our money. I am completely innocent." Xavier, who had been quietly observing the exchange from the center of the driveway, casually walked over to the officer. "Actually, Officer," Xavier said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly across the lawn, "this man is Jamal. He is the husband of the primary suspect. And according to the evidence provided by the forensic auditor, he was present yesterday afternoon when fraudulent forged real estate documents were used in a direct attempt to extort the original homeowner into surrendering this property." The officer looked at Jamal, his professional expression hardening instantly into suspicion. Jamal tried to take a desperate step backward, looking frantically over his shoulder for a clear way to run. The officer immediately reached for the heavy radio on his shoulder. "Do not take another step, sir," the officer ordered. "You are being officially detained for questioning regarding your direct involvement in an ongoing federal fraud and extortion investigation. Put your hands flat on the hood of the cruiser right now." The heavy steel door of the police cruiser slammed shut with a final resonant thud, sealing Camille inside the cramped back seat. The sound echoed across the driveway, cutting through the chaotic noise of the police radios and the flashing red and blue lights. I watched through the reinforced glass window as my sister pressed her tear-stained face against the glass, her expensive mascara smeared across her cheeks, screaming words that were completely muted by the thick soundproofing of the vehicle. A few yards away, Jamal was being aggressively patted down by two officers, his designer sunglasses knocked to the concrete as he whined about his rights. The absolute reality of the situation finally descended upon my parents. The protective bubble of delusion they had cultivated for 3 decades violently popped. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no manager to complain to, no check they could write to make this disappear, and no amount of yelling that would force the police officers to release their golden child. My father, Warren, stood frozen on the lawn. His shoulders, usually pulled back in a posture of aggressive arrogance, suddenly slumped forward. The dark purple flush of rage faded from his face, leaving behind a sickly, pale gray complexion. He watched the police officer walk around the front of the cruiser and slide into the driver's seat. Panic, raw and unfiltered, washed over him. He realized in that exact moment that he possessed absolutely no power in the real world. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. I was still standing perfectly still at the edge of the driveway, the warm paper coffee cup resting easily in my hands. I had not moved an inch. I had not raised my voice, shed a single tear, or broken my composure. I watched the exact moment my father's anger mutated into sheer, terrifying desperation. His eyes widened as the gears in his head began to frantically turn. He remembered the closing documents. He remembered Xavier stating that the house had been purchased in a massive cash transaction. He realized that I was currently holding over $600,000 in liquid capital. Warren practically stumbled across the driveway toward me, His heavy footsteps dragged against the concrete. The booming, tyrannical voice he had used to threaten my entire livelihood just yesterday was completely gone. When he spoke, his voice was a pathetic, trembling rasp. "Nia," he started, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Nia, listen to me. We have to act fast. You just sold the house. You have the cash from the transaction in your bank account right now. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars." He closed the distance between us, his eyes wild and pleading. He was no longer demanding my obedience as a father. He was begging me as a desperate, broken man. But even in his begging, the underlying disease of his entitlement remained perfectly intact. "You need to transfer that money immediately," Warren urged, pointing a shaking finger toward the police car. "The bail for a federal wire fraud charge is going to be astronomical. We need to post her bond the second she gets booked downtown. And we need to hire the best corporate defense attorney in the state. We cannot let her stay in that jail cell, Nia. You have to fix this. You have the money to make this go away." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his demand, my mother rushed over. Denise had stopped her theatrical sobbing on the concrete and scrambled to her feet the moment she heard my father mention my money. She practically shoved Warren aside and lunged at me. She reached out and forcefully grabbed my forearm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into the fabric of my coat. Her face was streaked with tears, her makeup a disastrous, ruined mess. "Nia, please," Denise cried out, her voice pitching high and hysterical. "She is your sister. You have to save her. Your father and I do not have that kind of liquid cash. We spent all our savings paying for her wedding and her cars. You are the only one who can afford a top-tier lawyer. You are the only one who can fix this. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go to a federal prison. Please, Nia, I am begging you. Show some compassion." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. The physical contact made my skin crawl. The absolute hypocrisy radiating from both of them was staggering. Just 24 hours ago, they had cornered me in a sleazy law office and threatened to destroy my entire forensic accounting career with a forged document. They had threatened to report me for elder abuse. They had happily conspired to force me out of my own home and leave me with absolutely nothing. And now, standing in the ruins of their own malicious plot, they expected me to empty my bank account to save the very person who tried to destroy me. I looked back up at my mother. I did not yell. I did not scream. I slowly, deliberately, and forcefully yanked my arm out of her desperate grip. Denise stumbled back a step, looking at me as if I had just physically struck her. "Save her?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, icy whisper. "You want me to show compassion and save her? Just like you saved me when I was 22 years old." My mother blinked, her frantic expression freezing as the sudden shift in the conversation caught her completely off guard. "You do not get to invoke the concept of family today," I continued, taking a step toward them, forcing them both to back away from my absolute fury. "Do you remember the week of my college midterms? I was hospitalized with severe double pneumonia. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed with an oxygen mask strapped to my face because my lungs were filling with fluid. I could not breathe. I could not work my 3 part-time jobs. The medical bills were piling up and my rent was due. I stared directly into my father's cowardly eyes. I called you from my hospital bed, terrified that I was going to be evicted. I begged you for a short-term loan of just $2,000. I promised I would pay you back with interest the second I was discharged and could get back to work. Do you remember what you told me, Dad?" Warren swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked away, completely unable to hold my gaze. "You told me money was too tight," I said, answering my own question. "You told me that I needed to learn financial responsibility and that bailing me out would ruin my independence. You let me discharge myself early against medical advice so I could drag myself to work while coughing up blood." I turned my piercing gaze to my mother, who was now staring at the concrete, her lips trembling. And then, exactly 3 days later, I logged onto social media and saw the pictures. I stated my voice, ringing with a decade of suppressed pain and ultimate vindication. I saw the pictures of Camille drinking margaritas on a private beach in Cabo San Lucas, a 10-day all-inclusive luxury vacation that the two of you fully funded because Camille called you crying that she was too stressed about her final exams. You let me drown in medical debt and risk homelessness so you could buy your golden child a beach vacation. That was different, Denise whispered weakly, her voice devoid of any actual conviction. You were always so strong. You were so independent. Camille needed us more. We did not know how bad you were hurting. You knew exactly how bad I was hurting. I fired back instantly, cutting off her pathetic excuse. You just did not care. You have never cared about my survival unless you could harvest my resources to make Camille's life easier. You demanded I sell my house for pennies because you thought I was weak. You thought decades of neglect had conditioned me to just roll over and take your abuse. But you were wrong. Behind them, the lead police officer knocked on the hood of the cruiser, signaling to his partner that the scene was secure, and they were ready for transport. The engine of the squad car holding Camille roared to life. Jamal was currently being shoved into the back of the second cruiser, his hands securely cuffed behind his back. I looked at the flashing lights, and then I looked my parents dead in the eye. The air between us felt charged with an electric, undeniable finality. You sat at my Thanksgiving table on Thursday night, and you gave me a very clear, very specific ultimatum, I said, pronouncing every single syllable with crystal clarity. You slammed your fist on the table, Dad. You looked me in the eye and you told me that I had to sell this house to Camille, or I would be permanently cut off from this family. I paused, letting the heavy weight of their own destructive words settle squarely onto their shoulders. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, feeling an overwhelming, beautiful sense of liberation wash over my entire soul. I sold the house. I said softly, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. And I am choosing the latter. The silence on the driveway was absolute. My words hung in the crisp morning air, heavy with the weight of 35 years of suppressed truth. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but absolutely no sound came out. The realization that his ultimate threat had completely backfired finally paralyzed him. He had handed me the scissors and I had happily cut the string. But I was not quite finished. I had one final piece of business to conduct before I walked away from this toxic family forever. I reached my hand into my structured leather tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my keys until they found the thick, heavy manila envelope waiting at the bottom. I pulled it out. It was sealed, professionally bound, and stamped with the official logo of David's law firm. I held it out toward my father. Warren looked at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. He did not want to take it, but the commanding authority in my posture left him no choice. His trembling hand slowly reached out, his fingers closing around the thick paper. "What is this?" Warren whispered, his voice completely hollow. "Is this the money for the lawyer?" I almost laughed at his relentless, blinding delusion. Even now he thought I was handing him a lifeline. He genuinely believed that after everything he had just done, I would still magically fix his problems and protect his favorite daughter from the consequences of her own actions. "No, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and perfectly clear. "That is a legally binding invoice. Inside that envelope is a meticulously documented ledger of every single dollar I have loaned you and Mom over the past 10 years. My mother gasped, taking a sudden step backward. Every time you called me crying about the roof leaking, I continued keeping my eyes locked onto his. Every time you claimed the property taxes were suddenly increased and you were facing foreclosure. Every medical emergency, every broken furnace, every fabricated financial crisis you used to guilt me into draining my savings account to help you. It is all in there." Warren stared down at the envelope, his hands shaking violently. "As a forensic accountant, my entire job is tracking where money originates and where it ultimately ends up," I explained, taking a slow step forward to assert my space. So when I was preparing to sell my house and sever my ties with this family, I decided to do a little internal audit of my own. I pulled my bank records. I traced every wire transfer, every cleared check, and every cash withdrawal I ever gave you. And then I cross-referenced those dates with Camille's public social media timeline and your own financial disclosures. The color entirely drained from Denise's face. She knew exactly what I was about to say, and the sheer panic in her eyes was glorious to witness. I discovered a fascinating pattern, I said, my voice dripping with cold precision. I traced the $6,000 I sent you for an emergency dental surgery directly to a luxury resort in the Bahamas where Camille spent her anniversary. The $10,000 you begged me for to avoid a supposed tax lien on your house was routed through 3 different accounts before it mysteriously became the exact down payment for Camille designer kitchen remodel. For an entire decade, you treated me like a disposable asset. You played on my empathy and my deeply ingrained desire to finally be a valued member of this family. You weaponized my love to subsidize your golden child. Warren tried to shake his head, trying to formulate a denial, but the evidence was sitting right in his hands. The grand total is slightly over $80,000, I stated firmly. $80,000 stolen from my future to fund a lifestyle she could never afford. Denise let out a sharp, hysterical sob. Nia, please, you cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We raised you. You owe us your life. I owe you absolutely nothing. I fired back, my voice echoing loudly across the driveway. I paid for my own college. I built my own business. I bought my own home. You raised a bank account, not a daughter. And as of this morning, the bank is permanently closed. I pointed to the thick envelope in my father's hands. This envelope is not a negotiation. This is the consequence of your actions. You gambled my loyalty against your greed and you lost everything. My lawyer David has already initiated a civil suit to recoup those funds. The attached documents are your official notice of intent to sue. If you attempt to ignore it, we will place a lien on your house. We will garnish whatever retirement funds you have left. We will take every legal avenue available to reclaim the money you acquired through fraud and emotional manipulation. Warren looked like he was about to pass out. His knees physically buckled and he had to lean heavily against the hood of Camille's illegally parked car just to remain upright. Furthermore, I added my tone, shifting into absolute unyielding stone. This is the last time you will ever hear my voice. You are completely blocked from my phone, my email, and my life. Any further communication must go directly through my legal representation. If you show up at my office, I will have you arrested for trespassing. If you try to contact my friends or my colleagues, I will file a restraining order for harassment. You thought you could strip me of my wealth by threatening my place in this family, but you failed to realize that being cut out of this family is not a punishment. It is a promotion. You are dead to me. Denise let out a piercing, guttural wail. She reached out to grab my father, accidentally knocking the thick manila envelope out of his hands. It hit the concrete driveway with a heavy smack. Neither of them made any attempt to pick it up. My mother collapsed against my father, burying her face in his shoulder as she sobbed uncontrollably. Right at that moment, the foreman of the moving company cautiously stepped forward. He held a digital tablet in his hand, looking incredibly uncomfortable but determined to do his job. He cleared his throat loudly, interrupting my mother's hysterics. "Excuse me, sir," the foreman said, looking directly at my father. "I am really sorry about all the trouble here today, but my crew has been on the clock for 2 hours. We brought our premium oversized truck and our full luxury packing team specifically requested by a Miss Camille. Since the job is officially canceled and the client is currently unavailable, our corporate policy requires immediate payment in full for the block time and the dispatch fee." The foreman tapped the screen of his tablet. "The total comes to $2,400. I need a credit card to process this right now, or I have to call my dispatcher to file a theft of services report." Warren stared at the foreman with blank, uncomprehending eyes. He slowly reached into his back pocket, pulling out a thin leather wallet. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck only to realize he was standing on a deserted island with absolutely no hope of rescue. He was about to pay thousands of dollars for a moving truck to move absolutely nothing, while his favorite daughter was currently sitting in a jail cell downtown. I took a step back, separating myself completely from the wreckage of their lives. I looked over at the black SUV parked at the end of the driveway. Xavier was standing quietly by the open passenger door. He had not interfered with my moment. He understood that this was my battle to finish. Our eyes met across the manicured lawn. He did not smile, but the expression on his face was one of profound, undeniable respect. He raised his chin slightly, tipping his head to me in a silent professional salute. He recognized a fellow operator, someone who knew how to audit a situation, identify the rot, and surgically remove it. I offered him a small, polite nod in return. Xavier turned, climbed into the back seat of his sleek vehicle, and pulled the heavy door shut. The two corporate security guards immediately got into the front seats. The powerful engine revved, and the black SUV smoothly backed away from the curb, turning seamlessly down the street and disappearing around the corner. The police cruisers had already driven away, taking Camille and Jamal to face the federal consequences of their own greed. I stood on the sidewalk for one final moment. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. I looked at the house I had lovingly restored, now belonging to a corporate holding company. I looked at the massive empty moving truck idling loudly in the driveway. And finally, I looked at my parents standing completely alone on the concrete, crying over an $80,000 invoice and a ruined legacy. I turned on my heel and walked back to the coffee shop. I did not look back. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was warm from the morning sun. I put the key in the ignition, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the curb. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not need to see my parents standing on that concrete driveway anymore. That chapter of my life was officially and permanently closed. As I navigated through the familiar suburban streets and merged onto the highway heading toward the city, a profound, almost physical sensation washed over my entire body. It felt as though a massive, suffocating weight had been lifted directly off my chest. For 35 years, I had carried the burden of their expectations, their disappointments, and their relentless demands. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be the perfect, reliable daughter, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same adoration they blindly gave to Camille. But as the city skyline grew larger through my windshield, I realized I no longer craved their approval. Their approval was toxic, and their love was entirely conditional. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my new building. It was a stunning modern high-rise located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. I had purchased the penthouse-level apartment in cash using a portion of the funds from the forced sale of my townhouse. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, the doors opening directly into my new sanctuary. I stepped inside and breathed in the scent of fresh paint and polished hardwood. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living space, offering an absolutely breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city below. The moving company had already delivered my furniture the night before, arranging everything perfectly according to the floor plan I had provided. There was no tacky entertainment center. There was no wet bar. It was just clean, elegant, and entirely mine. I spent the rest of Saturday unpacking my personal items, organizing my home office, and enjoying the absolute unbroken silence. Nobody barged through my front door. Nobody demanded my money. Nobody told me I was taking up too much space. For the first time in my entire life, I slept through the night without a single moment of anxiety. Sunday morning, however, brought the inevitable digital fallout. I woke up, poured myself a cup of premium coffee, and finally took my phone off Do Not Disturb mode. The screen immediately lit up like a Christmas tree. I had over 70 missed notifications, almost entirely from the extended family group chat. My mother Denise had apparently spent her Saturday evening spinning a frantic, entirely fabricated narrative to every aunt, uncle, and cousin who would listen. She had painted me as a jealous, vindictive monster who had somehow manipulated the legal system to steal Camille's house and get her falsely arrested on trumped-up charges out of pure spite. The text messages were incredibly aggressive. My Aunt Shirley sent a long, rambling paragraph telling me that I was a disgrace to the bloodline and that I needed to drop the fake charges against my sister immediately. My cousin Reggie told me I was going to hell for abandoning my parents in their time of need. Dozens of messages piled in full of guilt trips, insults, and demands for an explanation. They were all so eager to jump to Camille's defense, entirely conditioned by decades of my parents praising her as the flawless golden child. I sat on my plush velvet sofa, looking out over the city skyline, and took a sip of my coffee. I did not feel the urge to defend myself. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph explaining the years of financial abuse or the forged promissory note. As a forensic accountant, I know that people who are committed to misunderstanding you will never be swayed by emotional pleas. They are only silenced by undeniable facts. I opened my mobile internet browser and navigated to the local county jail website. Because Camille had been booked on felony wire fraud charges, her arrest record and booking photograph were already a matter of public record. I took a screenshot of her mugshot. Her designer makeup was smeared, her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked absolutely terrified holding up the booking slate. Then I went to the website of the most prominent local business journal. The news of Xavier's corporate sweep had already leaked to the press. The headline read, "Local Marketing Vice President Arrested in Six-Figure Embezzlement Scheme Surrounding Corporate Buyout." I opened the extended family group chat. I did not type a single word of greeting or explanation. I simply attached the screenshot of Camille's mugshot and pasted the direct link to the Business Journal article detailing her federal crimes. I hit send. I sat back and watched the screen. For a few seconds, several little typing bubbles appeared at the bottom of the chat, as my relatives prepared to launch another wave of insults. But as they clicked the link and saw the undeniable reality of the police records, the typing bubbles suddenly stopped. One by one, they vanished. The loud, aggressive, righteous indignation of my extended family evaporated into thin air. The group chat went completely, absolutely dead silent. Nobody apologized. Nobody asked for more details. They simply realized that the golden child they had been fiercely defending was actually a common thief who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from a massive corporation. I smiled, locked my phone, and tossed it onto the sofa. The silence was magnificent. The fallout from Camille's arrest continued to ripple outward over the next few days. Because my parents were now legally barred from contacting me under the threat of a civil suit, I received the updates through the very same extended family members who had suddenly decided to be polite to me again. My cousin Reggie, who worked as a paralegal at a downtown firm, texted me on Tuesday afternoon with a massive piece of gossip. Jamal had officially filed for divorce. It was the most predictable plot twist in the history of our family. Jamal was a parasite who only attached himself to healthy, wealthy hosts. The moment he realized the gravity of Camille's situation, his fragile loyalty completely vanished. Camille was facing serious federal prison time. Furthermore, Xavier and the corporation were seeking full restitution for the stolen funds, meaning any assets Camille held were going to be seized to pay back the embezzled money. Jamal, terrified that his leased sports cars and expensive watches would be dragged into the asset forfeiture, rushed to file the divorce papers on Monday morning to legally distance himself from her massive criminal debts. He abandoned her in her darkest hour, just like he abandoned every job responsibility and commitment he ever made in his life. Camille was sitting in a county jail cell, unable to post the exorbitant bail, because my parents simply did not have the cash, and her own husband was actively serving her divorce papers through the reinforced glass of the visitation room. My parents were frantically trying to secure a second mortgage on their own home just to afford a decent defense attorney, completely destroying their own retirement to clean up the mess they had enabled their daughter to create. They were drowning, and for the first time in my life, I was not going to throw them a life preserver. By Wednesday evening, I was fully settled into my new routine. I had spent the day working from my luxurious home office, securing the financial futures of my actual clients. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant orange and purple glow across the city skyline. I was standing in my kitchen preparing a simple dinner when the intercom on my wall buzzed. It was the concierge from the lobby. "Good evening, Nia," the concierge said politely. "A courier just dropped off a package for you. I can send it up with the bellhop if you are available." I thanked him and buzzed the door open. A few minutes later, the elevator chimed and I was handed a heavy, beautifully polished wooden box. There was no return address on the outside, only my name printed in sharp, elegant handwriting. I carried the box to my kitchen island and unlatched the small brass hook. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was an incredibly rare premium bottle of vintage Bordeaux wine. It was the kind of bottle you do not just buy at a local store. It was a collector's item representing exquisite taste and significant wealth. Tucked next to the neck of the bottle was a thick piece of expensive cardstock. I pulled the envelope out, broke the wax seal, and unfolded the handwritten note inside. The handwriting was identical to the name on the box, sharp, decisive, and commanding. "Nia," the note read. "I believe a successful audit always deserves a proper celebration. Enjoy the vintage. Furthermore, my executive board has authorized a complete overhaul of our internal accounting divisions across all acquired assets. We need a firm that operates with absolute precision, zero intimidation, and total transparency. If your calendar permits, I would like to know if your forensic accounting firm is currently taking on new exclusive corporate contracts. Let me know your availability for lunch next week. Best regards, Xavier." I stood in my stunning, fully paid penthouse apartment holding the premium wine and the handwritten note. The toxic anchors that had dragged me down for my entire life were finally gone, replaced by a horizon of absolute, limitless potential. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glowing city below, reached for my phone, and began to type my reply. I kept my response to Xavier concise and perfectly professional. I thanked him for the exceptional vintage wine and confirmed my availability for a lunch meeting the following Tuesday. When Tuesday arrived, I met him at a private, highly exclusive restaurant located on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. We did not discuss Camille, my parents, or the ugly scene on the driveway. That was completely beneath us now. Instead, we talked about corporate restructuring, financial vulnerabilities, and the absolute necessity of airtight accounting protocols. Xavier laid out his vision for his massive global holding company. He told me he needed a forensic auditing firm with zero conflicts of interest, an ironclad moral compass, and the surgical precision to cut out corporate rot before it could spread. He pushed a leather-bound master contract across the table. I read through the terms and signed my name. In a single afternoon, my firm became the exclusive primary auditing agency for one of the largest corporate conglomerates in the state. The growth was immediate and explosive. I had to quickly lease the other half of the 12th floor in my office building just to accommodate the expansion. I hired 5 new senior auditors and a dedicated administrative team just to handle the massive influx of work. Within the first quarter of the new year, my annual business revenue completely tripled. I went from being a successful independent accountant to a major player in the corporate financial sector. Every morning I woke up in my beautiful penthouse, put on a tailored designer suit I bought with my own clean money, and walked into an office where I was universally respected. My career skyrocketed, completely unburdened by the emotional and financial leeches that had held me down for my entire adult life. While my life ascended to heights I had only ever dreamed of, the universe was busy balancing the scales on the other side of the city. I never went looking for information about my family, but the extended family grapevine is impossible to completely silence. Aunt Shirley, perhaps driven by a twisted sense of guilt, or just plain old suburban gossip, occasionally sent me unsolicited text messages detailing the spectacular collapse of my parents' empire. I read the messages with a profound, quiet detachment. To keep Camille out of a maximum security federal penitentiary, a massive plea deal had to be negotiated. The federal judge required immediate and full financial restitution of the embezzled corporate funds, plus substantial court fees and massive legal defense bills. Jamal had already finalized his divorce completely, washing his hands of Camille and successfully protecting his own assets from the fallout. Because Camille was entirely broke and unemployable, the entire financial burden fell squarely onto the shoulders of my parents. Warren and Denise had no choice but to liquidate everything. They had to sell their sprawling, beautiful colonial house in the affluent suburbs, the very same house where my father had slammed his fist on the Thanksgiving table and threatened to leave me homeless. Because they were desperate and racing against a strict court deadline, they had to sell the house to a cash buyer at a massive loss. The neighborhood association they had spent decades trying to impress watched from their manicured lawns as my parents packed their belongings into a cheap rental van. They lost their luxury cars, their country club memberships, and their entire social standing in a matter of weeks. According to Aunt Shirley, my parents were now renting a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood near the industrial park. The irony was absolutely staggering. During that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, my mother had arrogantly told me that I did not need a four-bedroom house because I was just a single woman. She told me I should move into a tiny condo so Camille could have my space. Now my parents were the ones trapped in a tiny apartment surrounded by cheap walls and the constant roar of highway traffic, while I lived in a sprawling glass penthouse in the sky. Camille was eventually sentenced to a minimum security facility, leaving my parents to sit in their cramped living room, completely alone with nothing but their own arrogance and a mountain of debt to keep them company. I stopped responding to Aunt Shirley after that final update. I blocked her number along with the rest of the extended family, sealing the heavy steel vault door on my past forever. I spent the next several months acclimating to the true reality of my new life. The most striking difference was the silence. At first, the complete absence of family drama felt almost unnatural. My nervous system had been conditioned for 35 years to constantly expect an ambush. I used to jump every time my phone rang, assuming it was my mother demanding money for a fabricated emergency, or my father calling to berate me for not worshiping his golden child. I used to spend the weeks leading up to any major holiday sick with anxiety, mentally preparing my defenses for the inevitable insults at the dinner table. But as the seasons changed, the silence shifted from terrifying to incredibly beautiful. Thanksgiving came and went. I hosted a lavish catered dinner in my penthouse for my closest friends and colleagues. We drank expensive wine, laughed until our stomachs hurt, and nobody threw a contract across the table. Christmas arrived with a gentle snowfall. I spent the morning wrapped in a cashmere blanket, watching the city turn white, completely free from the obligation of buying extravagant gifts for a sister who actively plotted my downfall. There were no manipulative phone calls. There were no guilt trips. There was absolutely no one treating me like a second-class citizen in my own life. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was no longer the financial safety net. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to sit tight in my chest every single day was completely eradicated. I was finally just Nia standing entirely on my own 2 feet. When spring arrived and my firm successfully closed the first major round of corporate audits for Xavier, I decided it was time to properly celebrate my absolute freedom. I opened my laptop, pulled up my travel concierge application, and booked a first-class ticket to the Caribbean. Exactly 10 years ago, when I graduated with my master's degree at the top of my class, my parents had made a grand public promise. They told all our relatives they were buying me a luxury graduation trip to a premium resort in St. Lucia. I had been so incredibly excited. I bought new luggage and spent weeks planning the itinerary. But just 1 month before the departure date, Camille called my mother crying. She claimed she was severely depressed over a minor breakup with a college boyfriend and desperately needed a getaway to heal her mental health. Without even discussing it with me, My parents quietly transferred the resort reservations and the airline tickets into Camille's name. When I found out and confronted them, my father told me to stop being so selfish and to have some compassion for my heartbroken sister. I spent my graduation week working a double shift at my accounting firm, while Camille posted hundreds of photos of herself drinking out of coconuts on the beach. But today, nobody was stealing my tickets. I paid for the entire trip in cash. I arrived in St. Lucia on a gorgeous sun-drenched afternoon. A private car drove me up the winding coastal roads to a stunning five-star cliffside resort. The concierge greeted me by name, handing me a cold towel and a glass of champagne before escorting me directly to the presidential suite. I walked into the massive room completely overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of the space. The back wall was entirely open to the elements, leading out to a massive private balcony with an infinity pool that seemed to drop right off into the azure Caribbean Sea. The warm tropical breeze swept through the suite, carrying the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine. I walked over to the minibar, but I did not reach for the standard resort offerings. I opened my pristine leather suitcase and carefully pulled out the heavy wooden box Xavier had sent me months ago. I had saved the vintage Bordeaux specifically for this exact moment. I uncorked the bottle, the rich aroma filling the air. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass. I walked out onto the sun-baked balcony, the warm stone feeling incredible against my bare feet. I walked right to the edge of the infinity pool and looked out at the endless unbroken horizon where the blue sky melted perfectly into the dark ocean. I thought about the cramped apartment by the industrial park. I thought about the cold concrete walls of the minimum security facility. And then I looked down at my own reflection in the shimmering water of my private pool. I raised the crystal glass to the sky. I toasted to the massive moving truck in my driveway. I toasted to the forged promissory note that set me free. And most importantly, I toasted to myself, the woman who finally learned how to walk away. The trip to St. Lucia was the absolute reset button my soul desperately needed. I returned to the city with a deep golden tan and a completely renewed sense of purpose. As the winter months approached, and the city streets filled with festive lights, I realized I was experiencing something entirely new. For the first time in my entire adult life, the impending holiday season did not fill me with a creeping sense of dread. There was no anxiety about what passive-aggressive comments I would have to endure at the dinner table. There was no pressure to buy extravagant, overpriced gifts for a sister who would inevitably complain about them anyway. I was completely free to celebrate on my own terms. I decided to host a lavish holiday dinner party at my penthouse. I wanted to reclaim the season and fill my beautiful new home with the kind of energy I actually deserved. I hired a private chef to prepare a spectacular 5-course meal, completely eliminating the stress of cooking and allowing me to fully focus on my guests. I invited the people who had genuinely supported me throughout my life and my career. My dearest friends from college who had watched me build my business from the ground up arrived in their stunning evening wear. My top colleagues, the brilliant auditors who worked alongside me every single day, filled the living room with bright, intelligent conversation. And then there was Xavier. He arrived right on time, wearing a beautifully tailored cashmere coat and carrying yet another exceptionally rare bottle of wine. Over the past few months, our professional relationship had evolved into a deep mutual friendship. We shared a similar work ethic, a sharp analytical mindset, and a profound appreciation for honesty. Having him in my home, laughing with my friends and sharing stories about the chaotic world of corporate acquisitions felt completely natural. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows holding a glass of champagne and just observed my living room. The space was filled with genuine warmth. There was no tension hanging in the air. Nobody was walking on eggshells. Nobody was measuring their own success by tearing someone else down. The sound of real unforced laughter echoed against the glass. I realized in that moment that the old saying about blood being thicker than water was a complete manipulation tactic, usually heavily weaponized by toxic people to excuse their terrible behavior. Family has absolutely nothing to do with shared DNA. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and healthy boundaries. The people standing in my living room were my chosen family. They celebrated my victories instead of feeling threatened by them. They respected my space, valued my time, and brought absolute peace to my life. I raised my glass and offered a silent, deeply grateful toast to the beautiful reality I had created. The holidays passed with a joyful, effortless grace. The new year arrived, bringing even more lucrative contracts to my firm. I was thriving, entirely disconnected from the wreckage of my past. But toxic enablers never truly give up without throwing one last desperate hook into the water. It happened on a cold Tuesday morning in late January. I was standing in my kitchen sipping my morning espresso and sorting through a small stack of mail that the lobby concierge had sent up. Mixed between the premium catalog magazines and business correspondence was a plain white envelope. My stomach gave a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter when I recognized the handwriting. The loopy, frantic cursive belonged to my mother, Denise. She must have used a public directory or hired someone to find my new residential address because I had intentionally ensured she did not have it. The fact that she went out of her way to track me down proved that she still believed she was entitled to my time and my attention. I stood at my granite kitchen island, staring at the envelope. A year ago, holding a letter from my mother would have sent my heart racing. I would have felt a heavy weight of obligation pressing down on my shoulders. I would have torn it open immediately, terrified of what crisis I was being ordered to solve. But today I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I was completely bulletproof. I picked up a silver letter opener and neatly sliced the top of the envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. I did not read the entire thing. I did not need to. The first few lines told me everything I needed to know about my mother's current state of absolute delusion. Nia. The letter began skipping any form of polite greeting. You have made your point. We have lost our home and your father is working a terrible retail job just to pay the legal fees. But this has gone on long enough. Camille is suffering deeply. The conditions in that minimum security facility are awful. The food is making her sick and the other inmates do not understand her. She cries every single time we speak to her. You need to put this petty grudge aside and go visit your sister. She needs money put on her commissary account immediately. She is family Nia. You have the resources to help her and it is a sin for you to sit in a luxury apartment while she suffers. Call me the moment you read this. I stopped reading right there. I did not even skim the rest of the page. It was the exact same script she had been reading from my entire life. She was still casting Camille as the eternal victim. She was still completely ignoring the fact that Camille committed a federal felony and actively tried to destroy my life to cover her tracks. My mother was still demanding that I sacrifice my own resources to cushion Camille's fall. They had learned absolutely nothing. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I did not feel the need to call her and scream into the phone to defend my position. Engaging with her would only prove that she still had the power to affect my emotions. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to pull me back into the chaotic, muddy waters of her dysfunctional drama. I slowly folded the letter back in half. I walked out of my kitchen and down the hallway into my spacious home office. Tucked neatly under my massive oak desk was a heavy-duty cross-cut industrial paper shredder. I reached down and flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, powerful mechanical growl. I held the letter over the feeding slot. I did not hesitate for a single second. I dropped the paper into the machine. The steel blades caught the letter, instantly pulling it down and violently shredding my mother's manipulative words into hundreds of tiny, completely illegible pieces of confetti. I took the plain white envelope and fed it right into the machine after the letter. The shredder chewed it up and spit it into the plastic bin below. I pressed the power switch off. The room returned to its peaceful, absolute quiet. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them a single ounce of my emotional energy. I acknowledged the pain it took to finally cut the cord. Walking away from these people who brought you into this world is a unique, deeply complex kind of grief. It is painful to accept that your parents are completely incapable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved. But I also recognize that the pain of letting them go was temporary, while the pain of holding on to them would have been eternal. There is an absolute, undeniable freedom that comes from standing your ground against toxic enablers. When you finally refuse to participate in their delusions, you take all of your power back. You become the author of your own life. I walked out of my home office and returned to the living room. I unlocked the heavy glass door and stepped out onto my private balcony. The crisp winter air hit my face, refreshing and clean. I wrapped my thick cashmere cardigan tightly around my shoulders and walked right to the edge of the glass railing. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The towering skyscrapers were illuminated against the pale morning sky, the busy streets below flowing with the endless energy of the city. I thought about the terrified, anxious woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving dinner table over a year ago. She felt like a complete stranger to me now. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, feeling the solid concrete beneath my feet. I owned this space. I owned my highly successful forensic accounting firm. I owned my massive bank accounts. But most importantly, I owned my own mind. I was fully, completely in control of my destiny and my wealth. I took a deep, deeply satisfying breath of the winter air, feeling incredibly excited for whatever the future held next. Looking out over the city skyline from my balcony, I realized my journey was no longer just about my own survival. The air was crisp and clean, completely untainted by the heavy, suffocating expectations I had carried for over 3 decades. Standing there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of my own success, I knew it was time to turn my focus outward. I walked back inside my beautiful, quiet penthouse, set my crystal glass down on the granite counter, and decided it was time to speak directly to you. The person who is watching this right now, perhaps sitting in a room that feels much smaller than it actually is, holding onto a heavy heart, and wondering if you are crazy for wanting to walk away from your own bloodline. When you finally make the monumental decision to walk away from an abusive family society, is incredibly quick to judge you. People who have never experienced the suffocating grip of family toxicity will look at you with confusion and disapproval. They will casually drop phrases designed to induce immense guilt. They will tell you that you only get one mother, one father, one family. They will insist that blood is thicker than water, and they will try to hand you a script where you are the cold, ungrateful villain who abandoned your poor parents when they needed you the most. Let me tell you right now, tearing up that toxic script does not make you a villain. It makes you the ultimate protector of your own peace. Society loves to champion the idea of unconditional love, but toxic families weaponize that concept. They twist unconditional love into unconditional compliance. They expect you to absorb their endless disrespect fund, their irresponsible choices, and shrink your own potential just to keep their fragile egos intact. In my family, the emotional ledger was completely rigged. My parents operated a system where my debts to them were always infinite, simply because they brought me into the world, while my credits were always zero, no matter how much money I handed over, or how much abuse I silently endured. They demanded absolute loyalty while offering absolutely zero protection in return. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep your family warm. You are not obligated to offer your hard-earned success as a sacrifice on the altar of a golden child's ego. Walking away from people who actively plot your downfall is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound, radical self-preservation. It is the moment you finally decide to be the parent to yourself that you never actually had. You step up, you draw a hard line in the concrete, and you refuse to allow anyone to treat you like a second-class citizen in the story of your own life. There is a unique, deeply complex kind of grief that comes with cutting the cord. I will not pretend it is entirely easy. You are not just mourning the loss of the people themselves. You are mourning the death of the hope that they might one day change. You are mourning the parents you desperately deserved but never received. You are grieving the realization that the people who were biologically wired to protect you were actually the ones you needed protection from. That realization hurts, but it is a clean, honest pain. It is a pain that eventually heals, unlike the chronic festering wound of staying in a toxic environment and begging for a love that simply does not exist. For 35 years, I operated under the assumption that if I just worked harder, if I just achieved more, if I just gave them enough money, I could finally earn my place in their hearts. But toxic enablers do not value your achievements. They only value what your achievements can do for them. My parents did not see my forensic accounting firm as a source of pride. They saw it as an ATM. My sister did not look at my beautifully renovated townhouse and feel happy for my stability. She looked at it and decided she was entitled to take it. When my father slammed his fist on the Thanksgiving table and delivered his ultimate ultimatum, he genuinely believed he held all the power. He thought the threat of losing my family would terrify me into signing over my property. They thought threatening to cut me off would break me. What they didn't realize was that they were the dead weight holding me down. The moment they cut the string, I finally learned how to fly. And fly I did. The energy I used to spend anticipating their ambushes, managing their manufactured crises, and recovering from their insults was suddenly entirely mine to keep. I poured that reclaimed energy into my business, and my revenue tripled. I poured it into my friendships, and I built a chosen family that respects and uplifts me. I poured it into myself, and I discovered a level of joy and peace that I never knew was possible. When you drop the dead weight, the ascent is incredibly rapid. You realize that you were always capable of touching the sky. You were just anchored to the wrong people. I know there is someone watching this right now who is trapped in the exact same cycle. You might be the reliable sibling who is constantly expected to bail out the irresponsible one. You might be the daughter who is told you are being too sensitive every time you ask for basic human respect. You might be the son who is constantly compared to a sibling and treated as a disappointment despite your massive success. You are sitting there exhausted, emotionally drained, and wondering if you have the strength to finally say, enough is enough. I am here to tell you that you absolutely have that strength. The fact that you have survived this long in an environment designed to break your spirit proves that you are incredibly resilient. You have an iron spine, even if you cannot feel it right now. You just need to grant yourself the permission to use it. You need to give yourself permission to stop auditing their emotional ledgers and start investing entirely in your own future. It starts with one boundary. It starts with saying no to a ridiculous demand and refusing to explain yourself. It starts with understanding that no is a complete sentence. When they react with anger, when they try to orchestrate a smear campaign against you, when they threaten to cut you off, you simply look them in the eye and you let them. You let them walk away and you lock the door behind them. You change the locks, you upgrade your security, and you never look back. The peace that waits for you on the other side of that door is worth every single moment of temporary discomfort. The silence of a home without criticism is the most beautiful sound in the world. The security of a bank account that is not being secretly drained is the ultimate foundation for a beautiful life. You deserve that peace. You deserve that security. And nobody has the right to steal it from you simply because you share the same last name. We have to start changing the narrative around family estrangement. We have to stop shaming the survivors and start holding the abusers accountable. By sharing our stories, by standing firmly in our truth, we dismantle the power that toxic families use to isolate us. We prove to each other that there is a brilliant, thriving life waiting for us after the storm. Have you ever had a family member try to use guilt to steal your hard-earned success? How did you shut them down? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Your story might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to finally recognize their own worth and plan their escape. There is incredible power in our shared experiences, and this community is built on lifting each other up. It is time to take your power back. It is time to stop shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold your greatness. Step into the light, build your empire, and surround yourself with people who actually celebrate your presence. If my story gave you the courage to set a boundary today, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about taking your power back. Remember, your peace is not up for negotiation. See you in the next video.